Welcome to the story. Don't forget to subscribe, and support me.
The northern wind howled over the frozen plains, carrying the sharp bite of frost as it swept across the barren landscape. Towering in the distance, half obscured by swirling snow, stood the great walls of the frozen throne. Once, this land had been green, full of life, with villages bustling in the warm sun. Now, only the strongest humans survived in the cold that gripped the northern continent, a cold born from the rule of the frost giants. Cain pulled his cloak tighter, his breath coming in white puffs as he crept through the ruins of what had once been a town. His footfalls were silent on the snow, but even in silence, he could feel the oppressive weight of the giant's presence looming from the distant throne. No matter how far they were, their icy magic seeped into every corner of the land. He paused, kneeling by a crumbled wall where the remains of a stone building jutted out like broken teeth. His gloved hand traced a strange mark carved into the stone, a symbol that had drawn him here in the first place. It was old, far older than the time of the frost giants. If the scrolls he'd found were correct, it held the key to ending their reign. The elder in his village had barely believed it when Cain had returned with the parchment, stained and brittle with age. But there it was, a tale from a time long forgotten, a legend of how the frost giants could be defeated. Cain didn't know if he believed it himself, but what choice did they have? The giants had frozen entire villages where they stood, men, women, children, all turned to statues of ice in their tracks. If there was even a chance of freeing the land, Cain would take it. His eyes flickered toward the sky, where dark clouds gathered, heralding another storm. He didn't have much time. Quickly, he began to copy the markings from the ruin into his notebook, his hands moving swiftly despite the cold that seeped through his gloves. This was it. He could feel it. The final piece of the puzzle. With a final glance at the symbol, he rose and tucked the notebook into his pack, turning toward the east. He needed to assemble the others. This was no longer just his fight. It was humanity's last chance. The fire crackled warmly in the small cabin where Cain and his companions had gathered. Outside, the wind howled relentlessly, but inside, a hushed tension filled the air. Cain stood by the hearth, warming his hands, his mind racing with the enormity of the task ahead. Arya, a ranger whose sharp eyes had kept them alive through countless encounters with the giant's beasts, leaned back in her chair, her arms crossed. Her dark hair was tied back, and her face was set in the same hard expression she always wore when she was waiting for him to speak. "So, what's this big plan of yours, Cain?" she asked, breaking the silence. Cain glanced at the others. They were a mismatched group, but each of them had proven their worth 100 times over. Derek, the warrior, stood near the window, his massive frame casting a long shadow across the room. He had the build of a man born for battle, and his sword rested within arm's reach, as it always did. Lyra, the sorceress, sat quietly near the fire, her hands resting in her lap, eyes half closed as if in thought, her presence an eerie contrast to the volatile power she controlled. Torin, the rogue, was fidgeting with a dagger, his quick fingers making the blade flash in the firelight. He was the smallest of them, but his speed and cunning had saved them more than once. Cain took a deep breath and faced them. "I found it. The key to defeating the frost giants." Derek let out a low grunt. "You sure? We've been chasing leads like this for years, Cain. What makes this one any different? This one isn't just a lead. It's real." Cain pulled out his notebook and laid it on the table. He flipped to the pages where he had copied the symbols from the ruins. "I found these carvings in the ruins near the eastern mountains. They matched the descriptions from the ancient scrolls, scrolls that talk about a weapon or ritual that can break the giant's power. Lyra leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she examined the drawings. Her fingers hovered just above the page, feeling the magic in the symbols. "These are old," she murmured. "Older than the giants. There's power here, but it's not a weapon in the traditional sense." "No," Kane agreed. "It's not about fighting them head-on. The frost giants aren't invincible. They're tied to something, an artifact hidden deep within the frozen throne. If we can destroy it, their magic will crumble, and they'll lose control over the winter." Arya nodded slowly. "It makes sense. The winter isn't natural. They're forcing it on the land." Torin sheathed his dagger with a sharp click. "Sounds like a suicide mission to me. Getting into that fortress isn't exactly easy, let alone finding this artifact." Kane's jaw tightened. "I know it won't be easy. But this is the only chance we have left. We've been on the defensive for too long. It's time to take the fight to them." Derek crossed his arms. "And how exactly do you plan on getting us into the heart of the frozen throne? It's not like the giants are just going to let us walk in." Kane smiled faintly. "We'll go in the same way we've always survived, together, with a plan. We don't need to take on the entire fortress. We just need to get to the artifact, destroy it, and get out." Lyra looked up from the notebook, her voice soft but resolute. "I'll need time to prepare for the ritual. Breaking that kind of magic isn't something I can do lightly." "You'll have the time," Kane said. "Torin, you and Arya will lead the way, disabling any defenses and traps. Derek and I will keep the giants busy while Lyra works. We stick to the plan, and we can do this." Silence settled over the group as they absorbed the weight of what lay ahead. It was risky, but Kane knew in his bones that this was their best, and only, shot. The frost giants had ruled for far too long, and if they failed, the last remnants of humanity would be frozen and forgotten. Arya stood, her face grim but determined. "I'm in." "Me too," Derek rumbled, cracking his knuckles. "Let's bring those bastards down." Torin gave a lopsided grin. "Guess I'm coming too. Can't let you have all the fun." Lyra nodded, her eyes glowing faintly with the promise of fire. "I'll be ready." Kane felt a surge of gratitude and resolve. This was his family, this small, ragtag group of fighters and survivors. They'd been through hell together, and they would face this final trial the same way. "Get some rest," Kane said, breaking the tension. "We move at dawn." The journey to the frozen throne was harder than any of them had expected. The deeper they ventured into the northern wilderness, the stronger the cold became. The snow whipped at their faces, and even the fire magic Lyra conjured barely kept the worst of the frost at bay. They moved in silence, each step taking them closer to the fortress and the looming threat of the frost giants. They made camp one night in the shelter of a craggy outcrop, the wind howling like a living thing outside. Kane sat near the fire, staring into the flames, his mind heavy with the weight of what was to come. He could feel the doubts creeping in. What if they were wrong? What if the legends were just stories, and there was no way to defeat the giants? "You're overthinking again," Arya's voice cut through his thoughts. She sat down beside him, her sharp eyes glinting in the firelight. Kane chuckled softly. "Can't help it. This is big." Arya shrugged, pulling her cloak tighter around her shoulders. "It's always big, Kane. That's what we do, face the impossible. We've made it this far, haven't we?" "Yeah," he said quietly, "but this feels different. We might not come back from this one." Arya smirked. "We've had worse odds." She was right, of course. They'd been through battles where survival had seemed impossible, and yet here they were. Cain sighed, pushing his doubts aside. There was no room for second-guessing now. "We'll do it," he said firmly, more to himself than to Arya. "We always do." The next morning, they stood before the towering walls of the frozen throne. Ice-covered spires reached into the stormy sky, jagged and menacing, like the teeth of some monstrous beast. Cain scanned the towering fortress walls, eyes narrowing against the swirling snow that made the frozen throne seem more like a living nightmare than a physical structure. The cold bit deep into his skin, but it was nothing compared to the chill that settled in his bones knowing what lay within. They had made it this far, but the hardest part was still ahead. He could feel the weight of his companions' eyes on him, their breaths visible in the freezing air. Cain nodded toward the fortress, and without a word, they pressed forward. Tauren moved ahead, light on his feet, scouting for traps or signs of giant patrols. Arya stayed close behind him, her bow ready in hand, ever watchful of their surroundings. Derek walked with his usual confidence, every step deliberate, his massive sword strapped to his back. Lyra brought up the rear, her magic humming softly in the air, creating just enough heat to stave off the bitter cold for the group. As they neared the entrance, a pair of enormous stone doors loomed before them, etched with runes that flickered faintly with blue light. They had seen the giants' handiwork before, but this close, it was staggering. The doors stood at least 30 feet high, and the stone seemed to shimmer with a thin layer of frost. Tauren crouched by the door, running his fingers over the runes. "It's warded," he muttered, barely audible above the wind. "I can disable it, but it'll take a few minutes." Cain gave a short nod, motioning for Arya to keep watch. Time was not on their side, but they needed to get in undetected. If they alerted the giants too soon, they'd never make it to the heart of the throne. Tauren worked quickly, his fingers darting over the stone as he whispered under his breath. Cain could hear the faint crackle of the ward breaking, and slowly, the runes began to dim. After what felt like an eternity, Tauren stepped back with a grin. That should do it. Cain wasted no time. He motioned for Derek, who stepped up and heaved the stone doors open just enough for them to slip through. Inside, the cold was even worse, as if the very air was filled with the giant's oppressive magic. The massive corridor before them stretched into darkness, the walls lined with jagged ice crystals that seemed to pulse with an eerie blue light. "Stay close," Cain whispered. "We don't know what we're walking into." They moved silently through the corridor, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of ice beneath them. Every shadow felt like a threat, every sound echoed ominously off the walls. But they had no choice, they had to keep moving. They needed to reach the artifact before the giants knew they were there. As they ventured deeper into the fortress, they came upon a great hall. The ceiling arched high above them, and at the far end stood a massive throne made entirely of ice. It was empty, but Cain knew it was only a matter of time before they encountered the giants who ruled this place. His hand instinctively went to the hilt of his sword. "We need to split up," Cain said quietly. "Tauren, you and Arya take the left passage. Find a way to disable any remaining defenses. Derek, Lyra, and I will take the right. We'll head for the artifact." Arya nodded, her expression grim but determined. "Be careful," she said, her eyes locking with Cain's for a moment before she turned and disappeared into the shadows with Tauren. Cain led the others down the right passage, his heart pounding in his chest. The walls seemed to close in as they descended deeper into the fortress, the ice thicker and more unnatural with each step. He could feel the weight of the giant's magic pressing down on him, a constant reminder of the power they were up against. At last, they reached a chamber at the very heart of the frozen throne. The air was still, unnaturally cold, and in the center of the room stood the artifact, the source of the giant's power. It was a massive crystalline structure, glowing faintly with blue light, pulsing as though it were alive. Cain could feel the magic radiating from it, and it took all his willpower not to back away. "This is it," Lyra whispered, her voice trembling. "The heart of their power." Derek stepped forward, his hand gripping the hilt of his sword. "How do we destroy it?" Lyra took a deep breath. "I can break the spell, but it's going to take time. The ritual requires precision, and if I make a mistake, you won't," Cain said firmly. "We'll hold them off." Lyra nodded, her eyes flashing with determination. She stepped toward the artifact, her hands glowing as she began to chant softly, the air around her rippling with heat. Cain and Derek took up positions at the entrance to the chamber, their weapons ready. The seconds dragged on like hours, each one filled with the tension of waiting for the inevitable. Cain's grip tightened on his sword as he scanned the corridor, every sense on high alert. Then, the ground began to tremble. "They know we're here," Derek muttered, his voice low and dangerous. Cain nodded. "Here they come." The first giant appeared in the corridor, its massive form barely fitting through the entrance. Its skin was pale blue, covered in frost, and its eyes glowed with the same unnatural light as the artifact. It let out a deafening roar as it charged toward them, swinging a massive ice-covered club. "Now!" Cain shouted. Derek was the first to meet the giant's charge, his sword gleaming as he swung it with all his strength. The blade struck the giant's club with a resounding crash, but the force of the impact sent both combatants stumbling back. Cain darted in, aiming for the giant's legs, his blade cutting deep into the frost-encrusted skin. The giant roared in pain, but it wasn't enough to stop it. Behind them, Lyra's chanting grew louder, the air around her shimmering with heat as the ritual reached its climax. "We just need to buy her a little more time," Cain shouted, dodging another swing of the giant's club. Derek grunted in response, his sword flashing as he struck again, this time severing one of the giant's massive fingers. The giant bellowed in rage, but before it could retaliate, the ground shook again. More giants were coming. "Cain!" Lyra's voice rang out behind them, filled with urgency. "I'm almost there." Cain risked a glance over his shoulder. The artifact was pulsing more violently now, the light inside it flickering as Lyra's magic fought to overpower it. But they were running out of time. "Derek, we have to hold them," Cain shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of the giants. Derek nodded, his face grim as he swung his sword again, forcing the giant back. But Cain could see it in his eyes. They couldn't hold the line much longer. Suddenly, a deafening crack filled the air, and the light inside the artifact flared blindingly bright. Lyra let out a cry as the artifact exploded into a shower of ice and magic, the force of the blast knocking Cain and Derek off their feet. For a moment, everything was still. The giants froze in place, their glowing eyes flickering before they went dark. One by one, the giants collapsed, their bodies turning to ice as the magic that sustained them was destroyed. Cain pushed himself to his feet, his heart racing as he took in the sight. It was over. The giants were defeated. Lyra was on her knees, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she stared at the remains of the artifact. Cain rushed to her side, his hand on her shoulder. "You did it," he said, his voice filled with awe. Lyra nodded weakly. "Barely." Derek sheathed his sword, breathing heavily as he surveyed the room. "Let's get out of here." Cain nodded, helping Lyra to her feet. Together, the three of them made their way back through the fortress, the oppressive cold lifting with every step. When they reached the great hall, they found Arya and Torin waiting for them, both battered but alive. "It's done," Cain said simply. Arya smiled, exhaustion written all over her face. "About time." As they stepped out of the fortress into the cold air, Cain looked up at the sky. The clouds were beginning to part, and for the first time in years, the sun broke through, casting a golden light over the frozen land. It was over. The giants' reign had ended, and humanity would rise again. They had fought for this moment, and now, they could finally begin to rebuild. The future was uncertain, but as Cain stood with his companions, he knew one thing for sure: they had won.